Noa Tishby, Emmanuel Acho, it is great to have you here for a conversation.
Great to be here.
Good to see y'all. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for taking the time to talk to us and also to write this very important book together.
I love the format, the conversational format, because, you look at the book is significant, lots of chapters, but you do it as a dialogue. It's interesting that the title, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Jew, you're talking to two Jewish co-hosts of a news podcast here, different origins. Interestingly, I try to get into this a bit on my Instagram account and on the podcast. My father's a Jew born in Morocco with a family that goes back centuries. In fact, my last name, Wanunu, we believe is a mix with the Berber tribes of North Africa. And then on my mom's side, my grandfather escaped Germany in the 1930s. So I've always been trying to tell the complexity of the Jewish story, which is a bit of what you guys try to get into in this book, Noa.
Yeah, that is true. I think that, first of all, this book was Emmanuel's idea. This book was 100% Emmanuel's idea. I couldn't have even imagined writing something like this with someone like Emmanuel. And he reached out to me because he noticed the rise in anti-Semitism and the rise in the confusion and the rise in anti-Semitism specifically with the black men, with a bunch of black men. And he did that way before October 7th happened. He did that way before everything on campus exploded. He did that when most Jews were starting to notice it, but most non-Jews were not. Yeah. And it was extraordinary. And a part of the conversation that we've had, to your pointing out, was the complexity and the lack of monolithic. Am I saying this correctly? This is my Israeli coming out. Jews are not a monolith, basically, right? This is where my second language, people tend to forget that it's my second language. So Jews are not a monolith, and Jews do not originate from the same kind of ethnicity and colors and vibes and looks and places. And this was one of the most extraordinary conversations that we had was, are Jews white? And we were able to have these conversations because there was a context of love, appreciation, understanding, curiosity, and acceptance that sadly doesn't exist in our society nowadays, which makes people less educated.
I want to follow up on the origins of the book here. Because, as Noah was saying, Emmanuel, you approached her, but you guys note that this book almost didn't happen because of the aftermath of October 7th. Noah admitting that, she pulled out for a while. Explain how the book fell apart and then came back together.
Leading with the headline, I see.
Uncomfortable conversations.
What I love about not just this book, but this book is a reflection of life, if you will, is that Noah and I had a very vehement disagreement. To some degrees, we still disagree on certain things. Chapter 16 of the book is called How the Book Almost Didn't Happen. And most people try to hide their scars, but Noah and I, we believe that you could actually learn from our scars. And so after October 7th had occurred, I sat down to talk to Noah, but then I made a decision and speaking with someone, a particular person, and the decision that I made, Noah did not agree with. She didn't agree with that decision, but I didn't relent, and Noah didn't relent on her disagreement. And as a result, we both stood our ground, and the book literally fell apart. We didn't talk for 3 weeks, no texting, no calling, no Instagram liking. And mind you, Noah and I at this time, and still to this day, we're very close. Very close, talking all the time, supporting each other and everything. So it was a glaring omission of communication. We just didn't talk. Then finally...
Wait, and we should say this just because you spoke about it in general terms. This was a person who wanted to talk about the Palestinian plight.
Yes, yeah.
Out of October 7th. Yes.
Which is, let me just put a pin in that. If you want to talk about the Palestinian plight, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. Obviously, I say this till I'm blue in the face. I'm pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. It was that particular Palestinian person in that particular moment in time, because there's one thing to talk about the needs and desires and the plight of the Palestinian people and what it is that they should be getting. And there's one thing to say that I have no right to exist or that Israel shouldn't exist and Hamas is actually okay. Two separate things. Continue. Sorry.
This is great, everyone. You're getting a sense of the book right now. In real time.
Literally.
No, so we didn't talk. We finally came back because we realized there was more good that could be done in writing the book. We put our not our pride necessarily, but we just put our personal desires aside for the sake of the greater good of the world. And we continued to write the book. The reason I love the fact that it's in the book is it reminds and encourages everybody, Jill, like you don't have to agree on everything to have a conversation. Familially, occupationally, spiritually, like you all listening to this show right now, it is okay to disagree. Just because
tell that to Gen Z, Emmanuel.
I know.
it's
It's true.
But is there respect there? Is there trust there? Is there a genuine intention of purity there? And is there a connection there? And Noa knew my heart. She still knows my heart. So even when we disagree, we can still move forward for the greater good of those around us, which is something I hope everybody takes away from life itself.
Well, I'm glad you guys did, because it is, as we mentioned, such an important book. You guys talk about the tension between the Black community and the Jewish community. A half a century ago, Jews marched alongside MLK and the civil rights leaders. And just a few years ago, Jews marched with the BLM protesters. And yet a lot has changed in those decades, and even in just the past couple of years. And it feels like even within the past couple of months. So can you guys just talk about what you have witnessed and what do you think has led to that divide?
I'll simplify it because this is very complex. I believe that James Baldwin's piece, he wrote a piece in 1968 that I've read at least 10 or so times at this junction in time. And it's called Negroes Are Anti-Semitic Because They're Anti-White. He wrote that for the New York Times. I encourage everybody listening, if you do nothing else the rest of this year and read nothing else outside of our book, I encourage you to read that if you want to know the answers to this question. I genuinely encourage you all to read that. Negroes are anti-Semitic because they are anti-white. I will summarize. In my experience, Jill, I believe Jewish people look at themselves as Jewish. In my experience, I believe Black people look at Jewish people as white. And therein lies the problem. Because Jewish people in their experience, again, are like, well, we were with y'all. We were with y'all at MLK. We were with y'all during Black Lives Matter. But I don't believe that Black people differentiate. And obviously, I am generalizing. But I don't think that there is a major differentiation between being Jewish and being white. Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews. I do not think that the majority of non-Jewish people can tell you what a Sephardic Jew versus an Ashkenazi Jew are.
Because in their experience in America, the vast majority of the Jews they've dealt with are European origin.
Exactly right. And as a result, I hear the heartbreak of the Jewish people like, wait, but we were for you. And sitting here on the Black wearing Black shoes, it's like, I couldn't differentiate between Jill being Jewish and Jill being white. She just looked white to me. And so that is the simplest way in my mind to put it. There's so much volatility between the Black community and the white community right now. And so if the Jewish community is white to the Black community, then there is not necessarily a distinction. And that I believe is a problem. And Noa has a beautiful answer as well.
Yeah, this is the crux of the problem. The problem is that our society started to look at everything through the prism of oppressor and oppressed, which is essentially a Marxist ideology, and melanin in the skin. Literally skin color. And as soon as we started looking at the world through those glasses, which I say this a lot, but I'll say it again, I think to me it's reductive and unhelpful, right? The Jewish community doesn't fit these parameters at all. And when you look at, when you put the Jews into the bracket of white people, you erase thousands of years of Jewish experience and thousands of years of generational trauma. And up until a second and a half ago was no Jews, no dogs, no Blacks. That's just how the world was.
Right. No, we should mention my father, who immigrated initially from Morocco to Israel and then to the U.S. in suburban Chicago, saw those signs in the late 70s.
Of course. It's up until a second and a half ago. So we were suddenly thrown into that bracket. Suddenly we became the biggest problem with like colonialism because we became not just white, but the white oppressors. Not just white, but the ultimate white. The last bastion of colonialism that needs to be taken down is done by the Jews, which is so historically incorrect. It's heartbreaking. The other thing that we throw in there, and we didn't want to get into it because it's a lot, right, is that around the 70s, there was an infiltration of the Black movement, the younger generations, right, like the Angela Davises of the world, not the MLKs, because MLK was a Zionist. MLK was a huge supporter of the Jewish community. But the younger generation was infiltrated by anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian agenda that was pushed by the Soviets. And this rift was created intentionally between the Jews and the Blacks, and the fruits of it are what's coming out today. So it's there's a perfect storm that was created between the Jewish and the Black community that created this schism, and Emmanuel and I just refused to play along. We refuse to play along. And Emmanuel's getting a lot of heat from the Black community because of that. And I think he deserves all the accolades and all the love in the world because he's standing in in front of a huge firestorm. Emmanuel, do you want to share what happened to you as a result of your association with me?
Yeah, no, there was I'll share one quick story, Jill. I saw, obviously, you had a follow-up. I was at a restaurant in North Hollywood. Moshe, it was Saturday night. I'm by myself. I'm walking out, and I hear some individuals whisper to me. So I stop, and I turn to make sure I acknowledge them. Obviously, in Hollywood, I never want to be rude if I'm coming up to somebody that might be familiar with my work, supporting me, etc. I turn to my left, Mosheh, and I look, and this individual, Jill, she looks at me in my eyes, and she tries to pierce my soul, and she says, "I hope they paid you well." I stop, I say, "Who is they?" Now, for those that are listening who cannot see or are not familiar with me, I'm 6'2", 240 pounds, a former NFL linebacker. I used to be paid quite literally to tackle people. So this individual is sitting down staring at me in my 6'2", 240-pound frame. As I look at her and I say, "Who is they?" She looks at me and she says, "You know who they are." I look back. I say, "I do not." "Who is they?" She looks back at me, Mosh, one more time, and she says, "Zionists." I said, "My goal is to promote love, promote peace, promote unity." Now, Jill, the next thing that was going to come out of my mouth is possibly the most important phrase that I could utter because the conversation was going to swing on what I said next. I chose to diffuse the situation. So, Jill, I simply say, "What's your name?" Because if you can get somebody's name, you break the tension, Moshe. Obviously, we know this. She looks at me and says,
you humanize them.
No doubt about it. Well, Jill, she looks at me and she says, "You don't deserve my name." I said, "Well, I hope you have a great evening. God bless you." And I walk out the door. I say that to say, for Noah, standing in this moment would be protecting, the Israeli people, primarily speaking, if I may. But for me, standing in this moment would appear to be opposing so many Black people. At least that's what it's perceived to be in America. And so it's just been a very interesting tension that Noah and I are both experiencing in this.
And this is the trope. This was almost the embodiment of our entire conversation, was culminated in that incident that happened to Emmanuel, because I've tried to, we've talked so much about the anti-Semitic tropes that have been kind of shifting every few generations, but keep coming back. And herein lies the trope. You support Israel's right to exist, just basic as that, the Jews must be paying you. Here's the trope.
I saw actually, Emmanuel, in your, I was looking because I was curious what the reaction to this book and to these conversations has been. I was looking in your Instagram account and some of the comments, someone calling you Mr. AIPAC, which is an Israeli lobby. I mean, it is laughable to us, but unfortunately it is sad that this is, I guess, some of the reaction you had. I was also really taken with when you talked about in the book, just the relationship between the Black and Jewish communities. Also this idea of envy, where Jews who have been victims of persecution throughout history, but in this country are now what's viewed as kind of white passing, but at least by the Black community. I was hoping you could just talk about that a little bit.
Well, again, I'll speak from my experience, and this is probably the most uncomfortable part for those listening who haven't really heard this dialogue before, but Noah and I went there, and so let's go there. James Baldwin talks about how Jewish people, you can say the majority of them came to America for freedom, but Black people came to America for slavery. So the Black person and the Jewish person have vastly different experiences in America. Jewish suffering primarily, obviously, outside of America. Black suffering began in America. I was interviewing a woman named Tova Friedman, one of the youngest Holocaust survivors. I believe she's maybe 87 or so at this junction in time. We were standing on the Hudson, looking out onto the Hudson, rather. We were standing on a bridge looking out into the Hudson, and we were staring at the Statue of Liberty. I was interviewing her for something called, for an MTV show on the rise in anti-Semitism. And she said, "Emmanuel, when I look at the Statue of Liberty, it just reminds me of my freedom and my liberation." But Black people have a vastly different experience than being on a boat. And so, Jill, what I don't think enough Jewish people step outside of their own shoes. I don't think enough step outside of their own shoes and understand the relationship to America is definitely different. Not necessarily the relationship to suffering, but the relationship to America. James Baldwin puts it like this. I have it in front of me. Furthermore, the Jew can be proud of his suffering, or at least not ashamed of it. His history and his suffering do not begin in America, where Black men have been taught to be ashamed of everything, especially their suffering. And so I think the dilemma rises with the relationship to America. And the envy exists because, as Noah and I talk about in the book, Jewish people have the opportunity to grab this white passing card. Outside of so many Jewish people wearing a Star of David or having it tattooed on them or whatever the case may be, if they wanted to, they could just be white. Black people do not have the luxury to just be white. You see what I'm saying? And so there just lies a certain tension there if you are given a privilege that I don't necessarily have. Not your fault. It is not your fault, but it does exist.
Yeah, and it was an incredible conversation to have. This particular conversation floored me because I never saw it that way. To me, hiding who I am and hiding who you are as a Jew is horrible, but it's doable. And for a Black person in America, it's just impossible. So,
no, it's good. Why didn't we put that quote in the book? What you just said was amazing. It's horrible, but it's doable. But for the Black person, it's impossible. I'm writing that down.
Just came, just like
sequel for the sequel, guys.
We've got it recorded.
Well, you get at the idea of power in the book. Noah, you make a point of saying that Jews don't have power and control, even though they hold positions of power. And there's a back and forth here. And we're talking about, the Jewish representation or overrepresentation, you could say, based on our small population in places like Hollywood or in finance.
But I changed it from overrepresentation, because if you say overrepresentation, you insinuated that there's something wrong with it, and you're insinuating that it should be taken away.
Right.
So my whole thing is, and I took this from my friend Eric Weinstein, it's not over-representation, it's over-contribution. We over-contribute. That's what we do. And the difference between power and control is it's a very subtle difference, because it's okay to say that there are a lot of Jews in positions of power in America and around the world. A lot of Jews in Hollywood, because the Jews invented Hollywood, like literally invented Hollywood.
Yeah, explain the history that the Jews didn't.
No, I'm saying there's nothing wrong by saying that. But when you start having these thoughts about Jewish control, when you think the Jews actually control the media and control Hollywood, that's when you fall into the anti-Semitic tropes of olden age, right? And listen, the bottom line is this: if the Jews control the media, we wouldn't have been in the situation that we're at right now.
As a Jew in the media, I can endorse that 1,000%. We don't talk to each other.
I've been looking for the cabal for a very long time.
All of us Jews in the media. I mean, I run the CBS Evening News. I think there's another Jew who is in various positions of power. We don't have a conference call every day, the Jews in media, deciding what happens, despite what many people may believe out there. In fact, we don't talk to each other at all.
I'm all for it. I always say now in events, and I say to people, I'm like, they've been saying that we have a cabal forever. May as well start acting like we do.
Yeah,
it's
the opposite of it at times, it feels. Yeah. The book, you make a point of jumping around millennia by millennia sometimes to explain the background. And as we talk about Jews in Hollywood, Jews in finance, I think it's interesting the explanation of how Jews ended up there. Noah.
Oh, I love this right now. Look, if anybody didn't read the book, An Empire of Their Own, please go ahead and read this. It's how the Jews invented Hollywood, basically. And it's more than just invented Hollywood. There was no Hollywood. There was no concept of taking a movie, taking a play, filming it on this new machine that Edison invented, and then putting it in a room with chairs for people to watch. Like, the concept didn't exist at all. And it was considered a low-class thing to do. It was vaudevillian. It was entertainment. It was new. Hollywood, LA was basically a barren land. And the Jews were like, oh, here's an opportunity. Nobody else is doing this. We need to be successful here. Let's do this. And it's incredible to read just the level of involvement that they had in inventing this new medium and telling these new American stories. They were obsessed with America. They were obsessed with the American story and the American dream. And they created this incredible Americana of all of us to relate to, obsess with, and love, that is spread all over the world. But what we did as the Jewish community, even back then, is left ourselves out of the stories. We did not tell Jewish stories. We told what we thought was an American story. And this needs to stop. Like this is kind of like a repetitive thing that comes up. The Jews are kind of creating an industry and then just kind of leaving themselves out as a protection mechanism almost. But they wanted to leave the old world behind, not be that, be all more kind of like universal in their thinking and perceiving of what the new stories should be told. And instead, didn't tell our own stories. But it's
well, I mean, like
incredible.
Irving Berlin wrote White Christmas, right? I mean, among other things.
Right. So many of the Christmas songs were written by Jews.
But also the idea of you talk about the financial industry as well, and banking, and I think a lot of Jews,
money landing. Yeah.
A lot of Jewish people, I think, especially American Jews, don't know the history either, which is why it's really important that you talked about it. With that, I think a lot of
up in this white guilt thing that is plaguing America now. In this, they're swept up in it. Say, oh, there must be something wrong with it. No, know our history. Know who we are. I say this a lot to a lot of the Jewish community. We're not white. We're Jewish. It's an ethnic group. It's an actual ethnic group. It's white passing for the most part when you think of Seinfeld, right? But we're not white.
We wanted to talk about this idea of Zionism as well, which I do think a lot of American Jews, if you don't have family in Israel, you don't necessarily know the history of Israel. And so it's not just a non-Jewish thing to not necessarily know the history. And Emmanuel, I was struck by when you said you almost didn't want to use the word Zionism because it has become so controversial. This is something Moshe and I have talked about on this podcast as well, just trying to define it, because it's really just...
I get notes every day on Instagram from people being like, I didn't know that that's what it meant. I thought it meant, do you believe in that you need it for the second coming of Jesus, or it means kill all Palestinians?
Right. So Noah, could you talk a little bit about just what exactly is Zionism, and this idea of, can you be anti-Zionist? This is the new catchphrase. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just anti-Zionist. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sorry about that, Emmanuel. You can go take a break now. It was 6 hours of conversation. Oh my God, this can be an entire, entirely different thing. I don't even know where to start on this one. Okay. So first of all, here's what Zionism isn't. Zionism does not necessitate the genocide of Palestinians. Okay. And that is what it was created to become. It was hijacked intentionally, right, through a Soviet Union propaganda of 1975 UN resolution of trying to brand Zionism as racism, and saying literally Zionism necessitates the massacre, the genocide of Palestinians. That's number one. That isn't. Okay. In a very simple form, Zionism is Israel's right to exist. That's it. That really is it. If I expand on it a little bit more, Zionism is the Jewish people's right for self-governance and self-determination in some parts of their ancestral land in a Jewish, not an exclusively Jewish state. So that's the other thing that people don't understand, that Zionism doesn't mean that it's entirely Jewish state. Never did and never will. In fact, there are 20% of Arab Israelis Palestinian living in Israel with equal rights. And that is something that is very difficult for people to grasp. Very difficult for people when I say, oh yeah, one person, one vote. They're like, no, that's not true. I'm like, oh my God, right? So that is Zionism, right? The problem that you were alluding to, Jill, is the problem with the Jewish community around the world not understanding their personal connection to the Jewish state and to the land of Israel. And one of the things, other than human rights, the Jewish people also deserve a state, right? Very basic human rights. Other than that, if you're Jewish, your culture, your religion, if you're religious, our ancestral conversation, your tribe, is inseparable from a land, because Judaism in and of itself is an indigenous religion. We are an indigenous people that are inseparable from a land. I'll give you an example. Every Shabbat is based on hours of the moon in that land. Every holiday is connected to that land. We celebrate Passover, the first Zionist holiday, right? Talking about self-determination in our ancestral land. We're going to that land. We wave the 4 species in Sukkot that are indigenous species to that land. Everything that we do is connected to that land. So we are an ethnic, indigenous religion and tribe. And that is one of those things that is heartbreaking to me when American or international, Jews around the diaspora, don't understand that connection. So you can hate Bibi as much as you want. You can hate any kind of political party. You can hate what Israel's doing. Anything. That's totally fine. But you cannot describe yourself as anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. That these two things are inseparable.
Emmanuel, I want to get your reaction to that and why you think there's so much confusion around the word and what you learned through this whole process. And by the way, I'll add to it. Are you a Zionist, Emmanuel?
Well, I will give you all the answers you want to know. Let me start with the story, because I believe people might not remember things, but they remember stories. After October 7th, the day of October 7th, I believe it was, I saw Noa had posted on Instagram. And so I get off set. I work all day Saturdays. I'll work all day Monday through Friday, but also Saturday on college football. I'm a college football analyst by trade. So I leave the Fox studio lot in West Hollywood, Century City to be exact. I text Noa like, hey, I'd love to just have a conversation with you on Instagram Live. At the time, I had roughly 1 million followers, and I was like, oh, Noa, leverage my platform. Noah's following has obviously grown exponentially. So I was like, hey, beforehand, leverage my platform. Let's have a conversation. She says, thank you, babe. Would love to. So we get on Instagram Live, and I simply ask her, hey, what can I do to support you in the Jewish community right now? And she says, like, check on your Jewish friends, etc. I post that Instagram Live onto my Instagram. The next day is Sunday. I believe that would have been October 8th. I'm watching NFL games, Jill, as I normally do. I'm sitting there in front of my TV, eating whatever I'm eating. I check my DMs, Mosh. True story, everybody listening. It's a true story. I check my DMs, and one of my friends sent me, I can't believe your last Instagram post. At this point in time, Jill, I'm shocked. I'm like, I must have accidentally posted something from my photo gallery. Like, what in the world did I just put on Instagram? So I'm checking to see, like, oh, God, what did I do? What did I do? I'm scrolling frantically through my phone, seeing, like, what did I accidentally just post? I'm like, wait a second. My last post is with Noa that just says, check on your Jewish friends. So then I send that post to my friend who says, I can't believe your last Instagram post. She's a black woman. And I said, wait, what was wrong? And she said, how dare you simply say this? What about your Palestinian friends? What about the land that was taken from my grandparents? 700,000 of us had to evacuate this and evacuate that. Now, Jill, I'm freaking out. I'm like, uh-oh, what have I done? Mosh, I'm
welcome to the Middle East, my friend.
Like, yo, what in the world have I done? So now I'm like, uh-oh. So now I go down this deep dive of like all this freaking history. Keep in mind, Noa and I have started this book, because we started the book long before October 7th. So with that being said, now I go back to Noa's Instagram. And on Noa's Instagram, she had visited, I think it was Berkeley's campus. It may have been UCLA. No, I don't remember. What campus she visited? It was Berkeley. To some degree, that's irrelevant.
People's Republic of Berkeley, in fact.
So Noa's having a conversation with these students that are not anti-Semitic, but they're anti-Zionist. And in the midst of this conversation, Noah's telling them what Zionism is. And I just hear this one student go, how stupid can you be? You are the dumbest mother effer I've ever heard in my life. How dumb can you be, talking to Noa? So I'm like, Now, mind you, I'm a super peaceful person. Like, I'm a super, super, super peaceful person. So my experience with that word Zionism is somebody calling Noa a dumb mother effer, and somebody telling me, Emmanuel, a friend of mine, Emmanuel, how dare you, blah, 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 da, 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 a friend in which I inevitably had to go on to block. And I didn't go on to block her to silence her. I went on to block her because she didn't even understand what was left from right. And I was like, I can't deal with this right now. Now, answering your question most full circle, I'm promotion of peace. So with that being said, do I believe that Jewish people have a right to self-govern? Absolutely. But as I told Noa in the book, I said, and I'm not saying anything I haven't already said necessarily, but I said, see, Noa, Zionism sounds beautiful and peaceful when told from the Jewish perspective. Like, oh, we want the right to self-govern. Everybody else has a right to self-govern. The Japanese have Japan. Nigerians have Nigeria. The Chinese have China, but Jewish people don't have a land. I said, but when you hear Zionism from the non-Jewish or Palestinian perspective, it does not sound as peaceful, as kind, or as loving. So me being somebody who's not Jewish, my point of tension is, but what about the other side of the coin? What about the other side of the coin? That's where the tension lies with me as well, the other side of the coin. Now, I fully understand everybody else has a land, and people don't have an issue with anybody else having a land, so how can you have an issue with Jewish people's right to have a land? But the tension for me lies with, but what about the other side of the coin? And so that you hear that tension in the book, you read that tension on the pages, and I think that's what makes these conversations so valuable, is because Noa's willing to engage with me and I engage with her. There's no cursing out. There's no name calling. There's no this and that.
Other than baby. Hey, babe.
Exactly.
So Emmanuel, I have to ask this. As a communicator, from outside the Jewish, world. How can Jews, Israelis, do a better job of explaining Zionism, of explaining the conflict, of explaining all of it? Because if you look at the past 8 months, especially, it doesn't appear they've done a very good job.
It's a really good question. What I would be asking is to lose the human element of your existence, because I think the best way to do that is to remove your emotions from your explanation. But the dilemma is, as humans, you have emotions. And so if the Jewish individual can remove so much of the emotional charge from the explanation, I believe the explanation can be delivered better. But remember, the person receiving the explanation also has to remove the emotional charge from the explanation. So what I'm suggesting, Moshe, and I've had this conversation at length with so many Jewish friends, so I'm like, yo, but do y'all not understand how this might be received? And like, well, Emmanuel, we're too emotional right now. I'm like, okay, I understand the emotions, but so long as there's such an emotional charge, there won't be a lot of reception there. I'll give this example and then I'm done. Is after the murder of George Floyd, obviously I was emotional. I'm a black man, as I've told y'all, Jill, walking around in a 6'2", 240-pound frame. And I'm not like light-skinned black, because there's also colorism involved. You cannot misconstrue if Emmanuel's I am black. So, like, clearly I feel some type of way. Still to this day, Moshe, if I see cops, I might look down and not make eye contact, just because historically you've been educated as a black man, like, hey, don't even try to get into some sort of...
Right, there's, what do they call the conversation, right? That's happened with every young black man.
But I have to remove my emotional angst when I started uncomfortable conversations with the black man so that I could try to move more hearts and more minds. I couldn't get up there and use the fury and the rage and the righteous anger and frustration, because I knew that would not work. So that's what I would suggest. I would suggest, as well as possible, removing some of the emotional charge, which is human, which is just, which is valid, and which is right. But it can sometimes mute the conversation.
I love this, Emmanuel. We never had this conversation like that, because this goes perfectly to what I get asked in events all the time. And the first thing I say to people when they ask me how to have these conversations is, don't get triggered. Like, don't get triggered. We can't be triggered. I've had a bazillion conversations with literal anti-Semites and actual anti-Zionists, that people that actually want to take Israel down by all means necessary and are totally fine with 3 million Israelis dying in the process, because resistance is justified when people are occupied, right? And I can't get triggered. If we get triggered as a community, the message won't get through. So I love this. We never had this conversation, Emmanuel. Couldn't be more right. We're obviously very emotional. The community is very emotional right now.
It's genetic. It's epigenetic. It runs in our genes.
You guys talk about that in the book. Emmanuel, you actually asked Noa if she thought another Holocaust could happen, noting that you don't think slavery would ever happen again, even if there is still racism in the United States. And Noa, your answer was yes. And I think that really taps into a real anxiety that a lot of Jews have, and for American Jews, perhaps for the first time ever. These patterns kind of repeating themselves throughout Jewish history. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, I have been elaborating on this literal exact thing for the past 15 years of my life, because here's what I've been saying. And it's horrible, but it's also what prepared me for October 7th and October 8th, right? Is the analysis that this can happen again. What I've been saying, and what I think we need to kind of come to grips with as a Jewish community, is that a Holocaust, quote unquote, is not going to look the same if it happens again. So it's not going to look like gas chambers in America, most likely. Right. And I think that's what we had our eye on the wrong ball. We've been doing Holocaust education for like decades now, kind of going, how is this back? And the reason it's back is because it shape shifted to something new. And that something new is targeting Israel. It's targeting the Jews of Israel as the, again, bastion of white colonialism that needs to be taken down. And what we need to understand is that a Holocaust in America or in Europe, in the same way that it happened in the 30s and 40s, is probably not possible, probably won't happen again. But what can happen is the taking down, the attempt or the succession of taking Israel down, a Holocaust that would happen to Jews in Israel. And that would be the calamity of the Jewish people should this happen again. And we have to be very clear that the forces that be, meaning Iran and its proxies, are interested in doing exactly that. And what is happening in Western civilization right now is that Western civilization has been groomed to think that Israel is so toxic that the Jews are deserving of what's coming to them in Israel. Just try this as a thought process, okay? If October 7th would have happened and 1 million Israelis would have been slaughtered, 1 million, would the reaction be different for those people that have posted the paraglider the next day to celebrate what had happened? My guess is no, because to them, it's all justified, because they have been brainwashed to literally think what I said before. They have been brainwashed to think that Zionism, that the existence of Israel necessitates the genocide of Palestinians. So they have been brainwashed to think a lie is true, such that they are okay celebrating the massacre of Jews and or Israelis. That's what is actually possible right now if we don't wake up. And the other thing is this: when liberals in America hear the chants of Iran saying, death to Israel, death to America, when they are congratulating the college campus encampments, when Iran is literally saying what they want to do, they don't believe them. And when we call it out, they say that we're Islamophobics. Very dangerous situation that's happening in America. Very dangerous.
Emmanuel, what's been your reaction to all of this, what you've seen play out here? You know, the debate that happens within the Jewish community is some people are like, well, people have always felt this way. They just feel more comfortable feeling this way. And then some people say, actually, no, anti-Semitism has grown. As an observer to all of this, as somebody who's experienced all of this, as somebody who, you know, believes in peace and everyone getting along, etc. What was your reaction to you know, Noah just now there versus saying it's an irrational fear that these Jews have, and what's unfolded and what you make of it?
A very big question. A very big question. I don't know if anti-Semitism has grown so much as it's become more verbalized. Right? Remember in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, racism hadn't grown. It had just become documented. Like, now we got iPhones. Now we got social media. Now, like, black people have been getting unjustly shot, unjustly killed, unjustly arrested, unjustly all of these things. But now we can just post a video on Twitter, and now there's, oh my God, I can't believe this. So much of the anti-Semitism, particularly that came from very public-facing individuals, they believed it. They just had never verbalized it. And if they had verbalized it, they didn't have 7 million aggregate followers to verbalize it to. So I don't know that anti-Semitism has grown. I just think that it has become more verbalized, which I would suggest is a good thing in the long term, because I would rather know if you're against me than not know. Now that I know that you're against me, I can do two things. I can either distance myself from you, or I can help educate you. But I would rather know what's going on so we can begin to dismantle it, as opposed to it just lying in the weeds like snakes in the grass, if you will. And so that's my thought there. My secondary thought, Moshe, unfortunately, and Jill, I believe that there's the emotions at play are still so high that we can't reach peace right now. I think everything's just too emotional. I think people are looking through the keyhole instead of opening the door. And when you look through the keyhole, your sight is so limited. And that's kind of my heartbreak at the moment.
Yeah. Also, we live in a culture of picking a side.
Yes. Yeah. And because if we're being honest, man, sides get clicks. You know what I mean? Like, sides
we know. That's social media, man.
Dude, like, some people, I'm like, you don't really believe that. Half the time I look at stuff on Instagram, Jill, and I'm like, you don't believe that. You just want to go viral. So that's where I kind of stand right now.
But that's the whole idea it feels like the people who talk about social justice have really taken the side of the Palestinians. And Noah, I know that's where kind of you're all day kind of doing this PR for Israel, trying to say, like, there's more nuance here. This isn't the civil rights movement. It's not really analogous to the civil rights movement in the U.S.
Like Harry Potter. It's not about the dark forces and the white forces. It doesn't exist like that in the world. And again, being pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian are not mutually exclusive. I am very much pro-Palestinian, very much so. I'm just vehemently against jihadism. 100%. And if you are supported by the Ayatollahs of Iran, that's really all you need to know about your movement right there. There's nothing you need to know more. But people right now are so skewed to Emmanuel's point. It's all about clicks and likes. It's what Sam Harris calls the hallucination machine, that people are just like, there's no reality out there anymore whatsoever. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make some sense to people.
What do you think, Emmanuel, the net impact of the past 8 months have been, say the war ends tomorrow in Gaza?
In America?
In America, yeah, especially even within the Black community, especially.
It's super net negative. Because the problem is, I believe that we are trying to project our Western ideologies onto thousands of years of Middle Eastern nuance. And that's why what Jill just mentioned, like so many of the social justice warriors are choosing a side, because in America, the white man has been historically viewed as the oppressor for obvious reasons, 400 years. So if you view the Jewish person as white, then you're going to assume that in the Middle East, well, the Jewish person must be the oppressor. Whether they are or they are not, in America, you are conditioned to believe, based upon the empirical data, which also supports the belief, that the white man is an oppressor. So if the Jewish person is a white person, then they're the oppressor too, wherever they are. Wherever the white person is the oppressor. And so you don't even realize that the majority of Jews, particularly in Israel, are not white. And so, Moshe, I think it's net negative because we haven't yet dismantled the ideology that we're casting our Western ideas onto the Middle East. We think that how it is in America is how it is everywhere in the world. And that's just so wrong.
Well, it's the general American view is to apply our world.
Yeah, that's true. But
our experience on the world.
Maybe eventually there might be a net positive of this eventually. And this is a horrible thing to even think about because the price is so severe. The price in life on both sides, the trauma, the reawakening of the generational trauma within the Jewish community that we see literally rippling all throughout the world. But maybe it's darkest before the sun rises. And maybe this will allow for some sort of a breakthrough, both in the Middle East, vis-a-vis a joint agreement with Saudi Arabia and in America. I think what's happening to us as a society in the context of everything that's happening on campuses and this Islamism that is creeping up on us is a terrible thing for our society. Maybe that, to what you were saying, Emmanuel, it's not snakes in the grass anymore. It's out there. So maybe we can actually deal with that.
I hope you're right. Emmanuel, actually, when you were saying the idea that this is now out in the open, it's funny. I find myself as somebody who's Jewish when I meet new people, I find myself right away telling them that I'm Jewish, and I sneak it into the conversation somehow. And it's been totally subconscious, but I've realized that it's because I just want it out there. And if it's a problem, like that's going to be their problem, and they're just not going to be someone that I want to talk to or have an association with. And so I've never done that before. You know, that just, it's kind of, for me, that's where we are right now in the United States, where unfortunately I feel like this prejudgment and I, like I said, I want to know who I'm dealing with. And so if they're anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, I just want to be aware of it before we go on. I am curious though. It feels like, and I've heard this said before the war, but even more now, it does feel like anti-Semitism, which is the oldest hatred out there. It's with most racism, most hatred seem to eventually cultures outgrow them, right? It's like the oldest, the people who are, you know, it's like the crazy uncle who still seems to be the racist. And yet here in the US, it's like the younger people actually who are the most anti-Jewish and most anti-Semitic. So how do we turn that? I mean, that's what really scares me as somebody who has two young Jewish children and who's living in this country. It feels like it's the only hatred that's cool now. And what do we do? How do we turn that around?
I love what Noah says. At the end of the book, I said, hey, Noah, like, you think anti-Semitism will ever cease to exist? And she said, my focus is to make it go out of style. And I love how she said that, because it might still exist, but let's just at least make it less cool. Like right now, it's almost cool to be anti-Semitic. I mean, you got rappers making songs about like anti-Semitism and whatnot. And it's like people banging, you know what I'm saying, rocking to it and whatnot. So I think I'm with Noah on like making it go out of style. I also think there needs to be a lot more education and real education, not TikTok education. Because, right, that's where Gen Z consumes most of their knowledge, Jill. And so long as people are consuming their knowledge in that fashion, then either we, and shout out to Noah and her phenomenal social media team, we need to get more hip to the game and meet people where they're at, meet the next generation where they're at, and figure out how to best communicate. Because education is getting someone else to know what you know. It's the transfer of knowledge. It's not just knowing knowledge. So that's where I stand with it. Let's make it go out of style. Let's at least make it less cool. And I believe that's what we're trying to do with racism. That's what we need to do with anti-Semitism.
But it seems like an immense challenge, though. How do you make anti-Semitism not cool?
Well, first of all, you have to rein TikTok in. Like whatever needs to happen on social media needs to happen on social media, not just for the Jewish community or for Israel, but for like the world. Like we have to put a lid on it.
Don't you think TikTok's just a reflection of our society, or is it exacerbating the worst thing?
Creating society? Who knows? Listen, TikTok's algorithm is built to give you exactly what you're kind of looking at anyway. So it goes deep into your subconscious mind, into the deepest, darkest moments of your subconscious, and just feeds that because the amygdala loves to be tickled. That's what we're dealing with here. And when you are a 13-year-old, 18-year-old, you don't have the control and you don't have the judgment. If you don't have the education, that's it. You're out. You're taken. So this is bigger. I say a lot of the times that Israel and the Jewish community are patient zero in a worldwide post-truth problem. We're just a reflection of something that's happening in society right now. If you can convince people, and that's why anti-Semitism is an interesting form of shape-shifting conspiracy theory, is because when you start understanding, when you start believing all these conspiracy theories about the Jews, when you start kind of believing that the Jews are capable of this and are doing that, then it's a very short trip to take to not believing institutions, than thinking that everything is rotten and believing everything else. And this is what we're seeing right now. People are believing all these old things about the Jews in a very similar way that they used to in the 1400s and like 2,000 years ago and 80 years ago. And this can take our society down. It's a
I mean, the irony of having all information available. I mean, I remember the promise of the internet 30 years ago. We all are old enough. Like, oh my God, like every piece of information and facts at your fingertips. And yet it's almost had the opposite effect.
Because we live now in a days that at the time, there were still institutions that their job was to decipher what's fact and what's fiction. And now we live in a world in which Joe Schmo from Kentucky can create this account that is like suddenly telling you that whatever, and people are following it and believing it. So there's no
young Jews, unfortunately.
Anymore. Very much so. For young Jews, it's this guilt and it's this lack of education and lack of understanding of who they are. If a white actress, Jewish actress, can say, as a white, self-loving Jew, and I'm like, oh my God, you specifically, I'm not going to name names, you don't even look white. You think you're white? You're going to be on the train with all of us, So for the Jewish community not to understand that, it's heartbreaking. That's our job.
So what's next here? Are you guys taking the show on the road? I mean, we talk about education, Emmanuel, but it's a hard thing. I mean, you're talking about, the world's 8 billion people. America's 360 million people. TikTok has a third of humanity. Between TikTok and Instagram, a third of humanity is on them. I don't think the TikTok ban ever happens, by the way. Like, I think, that thing gets...
Not a ban, but please take it out of Chinese hand to start with.
Sure.
I trust it more when it's it's in some American company's hands rather than a Chinese company's hand. By the way,
people have similar concerns about Mark Zuckerberg of all people. And speaking of a Jewish conspiracy,
look, I don't say here that I trust him 100%, right? But there's something about a country, and I'm going to say something out there, right? A country that has no God. A country that has when you look at a country that when the state is above morality to some extent, I like to have people that are kind of fearing something that's bigger than themselves in a way. I just don't trust China at all. And I don't know who would at this point in time.
But
You know
to the
what they're
question,
feeding us through TikTok? They're feeding our kids dumb ideology, and they're feeding their kids science. What more do we need to know?
but to try to end this on optimism, which is
Yeah.
challenging at times like these, Emmanuel. But we talk about education, but that seems like such a difficult, like such a huge, immense challenge. The Jews always we whenever stuff happens, like if we could just get all of them to visit the Holocaust Museum, everything would be okay. That tends to be where we also take anti-Semites to, for a visit. Like, come visit the Holocaust Museum and you'll understand. You'll understand and everything will be copacetic afterwards. Is there interesting things happening on a grassroots level out there or programs or things you would suggest we begin with, especially since part of the issue here is young people?
I would suggest first and foremost to the Jewish listeners to educate themselves. I think so often things are just inherent to us, so we think we know, but we don't really. I have 3 siblings, and all of their spouses are born in Nigeria. And it's fascinating because oftentimes, I'm Nigerian American, for those that didn't realize, my parents born and raised in Nigeria. Oftentimes, my in-laws know more about American history than I do. Because as a foreigner, you had to learn about American history. I mean, they could tell me the presidents in order. I would still struggle. Like, wait, was it Reagan and then LBJ? And you know what I mean? Like, they know that. They could tell you about the Boston Tea Party and this because they have to pay so much more attention to it. I was like, oh, I'm American. Of course I know what American history and stuff is. What I found when I wrote Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man is I was educating so many of my Black brothers and sisters on the history of slavery and gerrymandering and Jim Crow and blackface and et cetera, because I had to go back and really do the work. I think that so many of my Jewish brothers and sisters could learn a lot from Uncomfortable Conversations with a Jew, because what you think is just, oh, of course I know that, I'm Jewish, or my mom was Jewish. It's like, no. Noah has done a deep dive on like the historical connotations going back to the Old Testament to present day, to anti-Semitism, to Zionism, to Herzl, to this, to that. Like, educate yourself so that when you get involved in these conversations, you do have the answers to so many different questions. And once you have the answers, you can figure out how you want to disseminate the answers at the right portion in time. You don't need to overwhelm everybody most with knowledge, but at least you know when asked. And so that would be my advice. And then shout out to Noah for just being able to run this race with endurance. I can't. I got to tap out. I'm like, I got to go talk about sports or something. I'm tired. This is too heavy. I'm tired of people hating me all the time. But then I talk about sports and they hate me there too. But I digress. So no, I think education, dude. Like if you don't,
right? But there's only like 7 million of us in America, man. There's not enough of us to go around and do the education. We need allies.
It's fine, Mosh. We've always been small and mighty. Who cares?
Mosh, you sound like me. I'm usually the one who's like funny. Doom and
usually
gloom.
On the podcast or sometimes off the podcast, Jill's like, oh my God, like it's all over. I was like, no, Jill, like let me take you back to the 1930s. Let me take you back to the late 19th century. I was like, we've always had it worse because I grew up in a set he died from my father of like, listen, it was always worse. It's always been like whatever your promise today, it's always been worse for us.
There is so much strength and resiliency in knowing that this has been attempted in the past and failed. This is not our first rodeo. I don't know why people I understand it's a very stressful time and it seems much more threatening because A, we live here and not in 1932 Germany, and B, because of social media.
Yeah, it's
but
in our pocket.
This is just what we're dealing with right now. Tap your it. This is it. We're part of a generational thing. We're part of a chain. We are the link in that chain. And I would never bet against the Jews. Anyone who's smart will never bet against the Jews.
I like to tell people that this is and you did the historical perspective here, Noah, but this has probably been our best since the Holocaust, the best 80 years the Jews have had in a while, right? And basically 1948 to 2024 was
100%. This has been the best decades the Jews have ever had. And the problem that we had, the mistake that we made, is we thought it was over. It was never over. It was always there. We thought we can assimilate. We grabbed our white card and we ran with it going, we're good. That's it. No more problems. My friends that are third generation Americans, their parents are blown away by this because they were the ones that were convinced that it's over, that told their kids, no, don't worry about being Jewish. We'll name you Tiffany. Don't worry about it. It's all good. And they are blown away. So it was just that, the perception and the acceptance and the expecting that things are different. And they're not. And since they're not, we also know what to do with this. We know how to fight through this. We know we have resiliency in our DNA. We'll get through this too.
So I want to end this podcast on a positive note because why not? Ends on optimism. In my heart, though, I don't feel it. And I speak to a lot of Jewish friends who have young children, and they don't feel it either. And they feel like this real fear. And I know it's something that you talked about in the book. For the first time, people are literally like getting passports together and thinking, where are we going to go? Thinking about which friends, non-Jewish, will hide us, thinking about having safe rooms in their house or where they're going to hide in their homes. And there is a feeling. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who has young Jewish children, and she's like, I don't know if they are up for this challenge of just dealing with so much hate thrown at them for just being Jewish, because we've never had to deal with it in America before. So I think you're taking the other approach, though, where you think we've got it. You think we're okay.
I vehemently disagree with what you say, and I'll tell you why. First of all, anecdotally, I hear a lot of parents that are very much afraid. That's number one. Number two, there's nothing wrong with being afraid. Fear is okay. It protects you. Fear, when it's not irrational, totally fine. You're okay to be a little afraid as a Jew right now, or even a lot afraid, and very much afraid if you are in the north of Israel or the south of Israel, right? There's nothing wrong with being afraid. But here's the thing. I'm seeing a rise in Jewish pride and Jewish resiliency and this roaring kind of generational power and owning of who you are in the younger generation, in high schools and in colleges, in the kids that I talk to across the board in a way that's so inspiring. I can't even tell you how much. I know these kids are looking at it. The thing is that the parents are afraid because they never had to deal with it, but the kids are different because they have to deal with it. So they're seeing it and they understand already that we live in a culture in which your expression of self and who you are should be accepted. And they're sitting there going, wait a minute, but you're not accepting my Jewish identity? It's okay for you to accept every other identity is okay and celebrate it, and that's wonderful. But like being Jewish is not okay? F that. And that is what I'm seeing. And I'm seeing this across the board. So I know that anecdotally, a lot of parents are concerned. I understand that. It's totally legit. And it's not just that it's appropriate these days. But I'm seeing these kids on college campuses and I'm seeing these kids in high schools and they're wearing the Stars of David and they're going, I am loud and I'm proud and I'm Jewish. And it's unbelievably inspiring. And that is the DNA that I'm talking about. That is this epigenetic inner strength and resiliency that's coming up and that's coming out in a way that we are going to celebrate that generation. That generation is going to take us forward. That generation is the beautiful, powerful generation of Jews that is coming up the pipeline right now. They don't expect to be loved. They don't expect to be accepted. They see that they're not, and they're fighting against it.
So just wanted to get at, the state of play more than 8 months into the war here. The Israelis say in the most recent update, effectively once Rafah is done the next couple of weeks, they will have destroyed, at least in part, all 24 of Hamas's battalions. So I'll leave it to the military folks to figure out the military, potential victory here. But the warning has always been that what could be a tactical victory on the ground could be a strategic defeat locally, regionally, globally. And was curious from your perspective, having been inside, been outside, the impact of this and just the perception as the abject failure of the Israeli communication strategy and the impact it's had on Jews globally here over the last 8 months, your assessment?
My God, there's a lot to unpack with this question. So there's no doubt that two things are unquestionable. Hamas needs to be dismantled, defeated. All the capabilities need to be destroyed, however you want to call it. That's number one. And number two, a larger strategic plan for the Middle East is required. I do believe that right now, the Israeli government, as we speak right now, they have been doing or still doing, God knows how long it's going to take, doing everything that they can to get the objective number one, and get the hostages out. So defeat Hamas and get the hostages out, number one. And then the larger strategic plan in the Middle East is going to be very important. And it's going to require, obviously, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states that are non-jihadi, let's put it that way, or that are trying to curb that ideology.
The Saudis and the Emiratis
the
and
Emiratis
whatnot.
and then of course an Israeli government and leadership that is imaginative as well, that is willing to take whatever steps need to be taken. It's very difficult to see this right now. The Israelis are rightfully so in complete in pain, in a lot of pain. But I am looking forward to the days when an imaginative new leadership comes in to plan and to imagine and create a different type of Middle East that will require a lot of moving pieces. The first things first, get the hostages out and dismantle Hamas, and then we can take care of everything else.
Right, but the cost of this war on the global perception of the Jews and anti-Semitism,
Terrible.
I mean, how far this has set us back?
Very much so. It's terrible. We have been ill-prepared in terms of public diplomacy for October 8th. Ill-prepared. Israel has been completely caught defenseless in everything and anything that has to do with public perception, made terrible mistakes, need to be taken care of as well. Need to be taken care of.
What did the other side do right? Like how did it become okay to be pro-Hamas on the streets on Western capitals?
Well, that's been going on for 30 years. This is not new. What's happening in our college campuses right now is a result of 30 years of propaganda and 30 years of brainwash and 30 years of stealth Islamism, as Sam Harris calls it, of re-education population to create Israel as such a toxic country. So what's happening now is not new. SJP and BDS and AMP have been active on college campuses for decades, preparing exactly for this moment.
And Israel dismissed it. Did Israel dismiss the threat? Did you dismiss the threat?
Israel dismissed it, Moshe. Not just Israel dismissed it. The entire Jewish community dismissed it. Everybody in America were looking at it thinking, well, it's on college campuses. It's okay. They'll grow out of it. And we tried to tell everyone that this is like a well-coordinated, well-funded campaign to take down the Jewish state. So this is what's happening right now. What's happening right now is not just the lack of a proper public diplomacy and hasbara and PR, a failure on the side of Israel, but of actual preparation that was done on college campuses and in the media in America by nefarious forces and countries that we know who they are.
Given, though, that it's now been decades in the making, and it seems to have infiltrated almost every college campus, and even the education system younger than that.
Ethnic studies and so on.
Do you feel hopeful that is going to be dismantled? Is there anything being done to really actually take that on?
Yes, I do feel hopeful because, again, it's in my first book. My first book, which came out, I wrote in 2019, and even then it was not new. I talk about this. I talk about SJP, AMP, BDS, from the river to the sea, college campuses, social media, all of these things were out there. The funding, I testified in front of Congress about the connection between campus anti-Semitism and terrorism financing. We know that there is a connection there. We know that some of these people that were convicted by the FBI for sending money to Hamas and other organizations are the ones that are behind AMP and SJP, which is behind everything that's happening on colleges right now. So we know this. For a very long time, we've been trying to tell the community, not just the Israelis, but the Americans as well, American Jewish community as well. And now people are finally listening. So I'm definitely hopeful because there is no question about the problems that are happening. Before, it felt like we were screaming into the void a little bit. And now people are finally understanding it, and we can actually fight against it.
Yeah, the issue always is that you're confronting. I mean, the First Amendment is the best thing about this country, and also makes it very challenging at times.
This is not First Amendment, actually, but this is not First Amendment. First of all, it's 100% incitement for violence. This is calling for, when you call for global intifada, you're calling for violence. That's what this is. There is discriminatory behavior. So that is as a result of these encampments, which is against the First Amendment. And look, bottom line is this: if you're calling to take down a democracy, by all means necessary, I don't see how First Amendment is even on the table. And that's what these organizations are after. They're not even hiding it anymore.
We'll use that as a separate thing.
Yeah.
And then I'll just do Emmanuel Acho, Noa Tishby, thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.